Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today for UNC Charlotte's issue of The Live Wire. I'm Lynn Robertson, and I'm the Communications Director for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And today we have with us Dr. Brian Magee, and Dr. Magee is a professor in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences. So today we're going to be talking about a very exciting subject, which is fire. And not only is it an interesting subject, it's a critical subject for us to consider when we're thinking about our Earth and the interplay between fire, the Earth, the Earth systems, and people. So, Brian, thank you for being here with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, tell me a little bit from a global perspective what your studies are about right now.
So, we have a National Science Foundation grant, and we are studying several questions related to how fire activity has changed in the past and what's going on in the present, but also what it means for future fire activity. And so we're trying to address scientific hypotheses and develop methods to address those and understand them better.
When we think about fire and we think about that research, what is the background of someone like you? I mean, how did you prepare for doing this research?
Well, my background is training. My PhD training would be in atmospheric sciences, and so I studied properties of the atmosphere of an atmosphere that was affected by fire emissions. And so I wasn't interested in fires per se when I began my research, but it was something that it was the biggest driver of the pollution that I was studying as a graduate student back in the day. And as I began to think about the context for my PhD research, I began to think at a bigger spatial scale. I began to think beyond the region that I was studying as a PhD student, very focused, very isolated, and began to think about it in the global context and what it is, how it is that my fire, the region I was studying, fit into the entire picture of fire on Earth.
So how long have you been at UNC Charlotte?
I've been here since 2011.
Okay. And you've been evolving your research over that time as you're looking at this particular subject area. Let's talk a little bit about why it's important to study this for us as people and people around the world.
Well, one aspect of fire is extremely interesting because it intersects so many different components of what we think of as the Earth system. And one of the components is what triggers fire, and kind of instinctually we know that lightning triggers fire, and that's true. And the other much bigger component in our present day Earth is humans triggering fire. And so humans and lightning both trigger fire, but then how fire begins to interact with the land systems, kind of what it does to the vegetation and the soils, affects then, once you burn the vegetation, it emits smoke into the atmosphere, and the smoke contains particles, it contains gases like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, all the various things that we associate with combustion. And those gases are emitted into the atmosphere, and so it affects atmospheric processes. And so you start to see that there's a systematic connectivity between fire, which begins with either humans or lightning igniting it, and all the different components of our Earth. And if you affect land and atmosphere over and over again every single year, which it turns out we pretty much do if we look at kind of global fire activity, then we begin to say, well, does fire and does our practice with fire, does it change climate? And does climate change also affect fire activity? And so there's all sorts of great questions that kind of evolve from just studying, something as simple looking as a fire.
So I'm hearing a cycle. It sounds as if, so when you say the Earth systems, what does that mean to you as someone who studies in this discipline? So we can make sure we're thinking about the concept from your research perspective.
Yeah, so I'm looking at sort of how you could imagine that all these different components sort of play off of each other to some degree. And so changing one component will have the effect of changing another component, all of which can change the underlying kind of prerequisites sort of for fire activity to either occur or propagate or explode into sort of the kind of fiery infernos that we sometimes see in the news.
Right. So when you talk about the things that contribute to fire, and you talk about lightning, you talk about humans, are there differences in the way those fires then affect the Earth, the impact on, locally and then also globally?
Yeah, it's it depends on the magnitude of the fire activity in any particular location. So where I began my studies was in southern Africa, and southern Africa burns an incredible amount of land area each year, and almost all of that is due to human activity, humans managing a landscape. And
What does that mean, humans managing the landscape?
right, so we can think to cultivation of our landscape for pasture and for cropland are the two primary
So
sort of
burning
reasons.
fields
Yeah,
to...
burning fields, right. So if we're burning a field, we're trying to reinvigorate growth, new growth in the soil and energize the growth for the next season. And that's true for pasture, it's true for cropland. And of course, you burn them at different cycles depending on the growing season for that particular part of the world. And in southern Africa, it's primarily pastureland that's being burned as opposed to cropland. In something like the breadbasket of the United States, you would expect that there is prolific cropland burning. And depending on the part of the world, it could be cornfields, wheat fields, all the different grains that we know and that we...
So there is cropland burning in the United States, but it's not to the magnitude of, you mentioned Africa, perhaps some other continents, other countries.
Yeah, so part of the way that we study past fire activity is by understanding what's going on in the present day. And to understand what's going on in the present day, we can turn to satellite imagery. And there's NASA satellites that have been in space since the year 2000, at least, depending on who you talk to. But the best satellites that are available have been up there since the year 2000. And so we have more than a decade of data where they've observed the fire activity on our planet. And we can isolate where on Earth fire activity is most prolific. And we can begin to ask questions as to why it's most prolific, and then ask questions about why it changes and whether it's changing over time.
So when you are doing that research and looking at, the imagery from NASA, other data, how does that play out? I mean, how do you actually use that data? And you mentioned looking at now and then looking historically, so looking backward at data, imagery, that kind of thing. Can you describe that a little bit, the process itself, and then how that leads to the future? Because my assumption is that we're studying the past to help us understand what is going on now, and then in some kind of predictive manner for the future. And then I guess a corollary question, is it predictive for policy reasons, for regulatory reasons, all that kind of interplay?
Yeah,
So.
those are about 3 or 4 questions.
I know, my head is just spinning from everything you're talking about.
So
Answer them in any order you wish.
So I think, if we think about how it is we can ingest sort of the data that we have for the present day, we can look to the satellite imagery, and it's almost like looking at a satellite, data that would represent something like population on the Earth. And so we can kind of translate that to the world of fire, and we can begin to say, well, what is it that's underlying that fire system? And we turn back to the systematic type of understanding of our Earth to say, okay, so what kind of land area is underneath that fire activity that's occurring in one place on Earth?
So you see the fires, and then you say, okay, how does that shape up with a map or with a globe? Right?
So
What's
we look
there?
for interplay between the land systems and the atmosphere and the climate system, and we kind of do spatial analysis to try to understand why fire would be occurring there at all. Right. And you can quickly see when you start to put the data down on paper that in some parts of the world it doesn't seem like that many fires should be occurring. But then you overlay the human component, the fact that there's human population there and that they are managing their landscape for pasture, cropland.
As humans move, is that part of the dynamic as populations grow, or they push into other areas?
Absolutely. And so, you expect, so the instinct there, if I say humans trigger fire, the instinct would be to think that, well, there's been a huge population increase, and dramatic even since the 50s and 1950s, and you'd expect fire activity to have skyrocketed as a result. But when you look at it in more detail, you start to see that there's actually, as human population increases, you also see a suppressive effect, meaning that you could imagine, like, for example, the most extreme place for human population density would be an urban center. And in an urban center, if a fire were to break out from a lightning strike or somebody burning their field in the vicinity and somehow escaping into a city, which doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is because it's suppressed. And that's because, one, the architecture of the city doesn't allow for it. So that adds kind of a indirect suppressive effect on fire. But then also the humans living in high population density are not going to let a fire escape into their city because it's going to burn
All the
homes
property and the
threaten people's
lives,
lives.
right.
Yeah. So I mean that combination of humans increasing in population, but not necessarily fire increasing in tandem, illustrates how strong an impact the human system has on the fire system.
So it's not only the impact on increase in fires, but also decrease in fires in some areas.
And that's where we start to look deeper into the past. And the satellite era, as amazing as the data sets are, and we all rely on, every researcher I know knows the data sets really well, and we know what the limits are, but we know we can learn from them more importantly. One of the things we do, though, is we start to look into the past to try to understand a little bit more about the context for the present day fires, meaning that if we have so many fires on Earth occurring in the present day, what does it mean? You know, what was happening 100 years ago? What was happening 500 years ago? What was happening 1,000 years ago? And it turns out we can start to answer those questions. And that's part of the research I'm doing with colleagues, is that we're trying to understand a little bit more about how the past can inform the context for the present day. Are we looking at a world that's burning out of control right now? Or are we looking at a world that is well below what we'd expect for burning on a planet that has the certain conditions that it does?
So looking at the not the lifespan, but the recorded past of the Earth, whether it's through imagery or other data that you can access.
Mm-hmm.
So putting it into context, you mentioned you're looking at are we at a peak right now with fires, looking historically. You mentioned earlier news coverage. There's been quite a bit of news coverage of fires that we're having in the United States, in the West, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of coverage of that. If you were to put that in perspective with fires that are going on around the world, how does that compare?
Yeah, and we can turn to the present day data sets for that to try to contextualize the magnitude of fires that are happening in the Western US and Western North America in general. And we can see when we look at maps of where fires are occurring on the planet, that roughly 2 to 3 million fires occur any given year on the planet. And so there's a lot of fires that occur, and that's a huge number.
And are these ones that have to be large enough to be captured on satellite? So we're talking about fires of significance, something that...
Not too big. Satellites are detailed enough that they can capture fires that are on the order of about 50 feet. I mean, if they see because it's such a dramatic signal, a dramatic change from the landscape that it usually is sitting there. And you can imagine that, like, if you think of movies and you look at, they draw these kind of like thermal infrared type of things where you see heat, the body heat of a human being or an animal. That kind of thing, that sort of heat signature is what satellites capture when they actually try to see fires and count fires. And so it's a very dramatic signal.
So so we're at 2 to 3 million a year now in the Earth. And how's that putting the North American West into perspective?
Right.
Yeah.
So of those 2 to 3 million, let's say 2 million just for a round number. It varies from year to year.
Right.
But about 50% of those fires, those 2 million fires, occur on the continent of Africa. And so right away, you can find the king of fire activity being the continent of Africa, and it varies from country to country, but primarily it's in sub-Saharan Africa and in southern Africa, south of the Congo River Basin. So it's outside of the rainforest, it's outside of the desert, it's in between. And so where are the rest of the fires? Well, the rest of the fires do not occur in the USA either. Most of the fires tend to occur, about almost 75% in total, occur in the tropics. And so the fire is really, and many fire researchers would argue this as well, it's a tropical phenomenon in terms of numbers. But in terms of impact and in terms of other aspects of fire, like how much area it burns, that's a big key kind of difference between the fires that occur in the Western U.S. and the fires that occur in the tropics. The fires in the tropics tend to be small, isolated, and human-caused. And in the Western U.S., there's a larger proportion of fires that occur because of lightning activity, and those fires can rage quite out of control in the sense of how much area they burn. But if you look at the number of fires, only about 4 or 5% of fire activity occurs in the USA in total, on the entire planet. And that's a remarkably small number compared to the amount of press coverage it gets. And the reason it gets press coverage, of course, is that the fires are occurring at an interface between kind of the urban environment, or the suburb environment, and an ecosystem that is prone to fire or that needs fire to exist. So people are building where fire lives, right? And so you're building into their neighborhood, and of course you're going to have that interface that can be
It's
dramatic.
like we're building where wildlife has lived, and that interface as well.
Yeah, we can manage wildlife a lot better, though. So.
Well, so you embedded in my questions earlier were, what are the implications for this research? You know, whether you look at it from a policy perspective, whether you look at it from a climatology perspective. You mentioned the climate, pollution, air pollution. So maybe
Right.
talk a little bit about, okay, we know what you're studying, you and other scientists in this global connected network of scientists who are looking at this. So why are we looking at this? What are the potential outcomes for this research?
Yeah, so it's definitely a focus of why we'd even set this research project up. So what is it? What is the importance? What is the relevance to the bigger picture, right? And so we're trying to, the project we're working on most in a most dedicated fashion is understanding how the past fire activity can inform our understanding of present day and future fire activity. And so we're trying to understand what the systems are doing in total, understanding both land, atmosphere, and the very prerequisites, the underlying factors that are required for fire to be triggered and spread. And we're trying to understand how that information from the past can help us understand what's going to happen in the future, because we know the climate is changing. We know there's warming that's occurring. There's land changes that are dramatic and already evident in the system. And those land and atmosphere changes are going to have impacts on fire activity. What those impacts will be when you overlay a human system on top of all that, a human system that is changing, is a big question. All things being equal, we would expect fire activity to increase if it gets warmer and drier in many parts of the earth. But it's not totally clear that that's the conclusion. And so we're trying to build testable hypotheses based on what we've seen in the past to understand the future. And the way we do that is we're using a very key time in the past, we call it the past millennium, the past 1,000 years. And the past millennium has an unusual confluence of diverse data sources. So we have things like tree ring records and ice cores that tell us a lot about the climate, so the temperature and the precipitation and what kind of what those two factors. But we also know a lot about the vegetation, partly because we know something about what humans were doing, and partly because we have ecological evidence of what kind of vegetation was actually dominant in any given part of the world. And so geographers of many different disciplines they put together these maps of what the atmosphere, what the precipitation, what the vegetation all looked like, and then also where humans were. And together, that information, that confluence of information, lets us know what's going on, or gives us the ability to test what's happening over the past millennium. And we picked key parts of that climate regime where it was a little bit warmer than average and a little bit colder than average over the past 1,000 years during two key periods. And we use those as sort of opportunities to test hypotheses about what that means for fire activity. We look at how the fire system responded to those two climate shifts that happened in the past millennium.
So it sounds as if, and I had mentioned a network of researchers globally, worldwide, correct?
Yes.
And of course you're involved with a project with funded by the National Science Foundation with some colleagues, I think with, there's two other universities involved, right, in that particular project.
Yeah, so I work with colleagues at Yale University and a colleague at University of Oregon as well.
Okay. What you just described is bigger than that group, yes? I mean, it sounds as if a wide array of scientists from various disciplines within geography and neurosciences and maybe some other disciplines as well, it sounds like. But there seems to be agreement on some of the structure around how to study this, and yet there still aren't the finite answers, right? There still are things that you are all collaborating on and sharing information.
It's a very diverse research group. I mean, and even amongst the three investigators on this one grant, myself and my two colleagues from Yale and University of Oregon, I think there's diversity in sort of how we approached fire. They both come from to fire from the perspective of paleoclimatology, meaning they study past climates. And they also bring to the table sort of a study of database methods to understand past fire activity.
And then what are you bringing to
So yeah, my expertise is from the sort of the modeling or the simulation type of aspect of fire activity on the planet, meaning that I have mathematical models and run these models to try to understand how fire works. And usually those models are run for the present day, where we have the most data and we can check our results and we can verify whether the model is at least telling us something that we can believe. What we don't know very much about is how these models, these computer models like I use to simulate fire activity, how they behave in the past. And so this is where we intersect with, my colleagues and I intersect most directly. They know a lot about the past and they know a lot about the present too, but I know a lot about the present in terms of simulations. And
So
we
you
bring
can
those two
intersect
together.
the historical data with what.
So if we can, if you think back to this idea of a confluence of data over the past millennium, data is what we need to make models. And we don't make models out of thin air. And a lot of times, at least in Earth system sciences, they aren't based on pure theory in the sense that we can just say, this is why fire occurs, one sentence, point, that's it. It's usually for a number of different reasons and a number of reasons that we may or may not understand perfectly. So we have to test the sensitivity, of our models to whatever conditions we put in. And the advantage of creating a computer model or a simulation is that we can test a wide variety of conditions. And because it's a model, we can just run the model for a number of different ways and see how the fire system that our model simulates responds. And then see and validate it against sort of database methods. And it's not going to be validation done, it's more like an iterative process, meaning we do that. We kind of revisit the model, we revisit the data, we say, what's the data really telling us? What are the uncertainties? What's the model telling us? What are the uncertainties? And see where the intersection is and whether we can actually try to advance the science in a way that allows us to address the hypotheses that the original project kind of put on the table.
So I'm curious about, you also teach.
Yes.
Obviously, you teach here at UNC Charlotte. So you have all this research going on, and of course you have some students who work with you directly on the research, but how do you bring back what you're learning or the practices to your classrooms? I mean, what do you try to impart with the students every day in that environment?
So I primarily teach meteorology students here at UNC Charlotte. I also teach a class called Global Environmental Change, and all my courses, what I love to do is bring some of the current research questions, not always global fire activity. It can be a little bit kind of, it can take maybe one too many lectures to do that. But I do introduce the idea that I'm looking at this kind of problems in weather, climate, and geography from a big perspective that, as an undergraduate, when I was an undergraduate, I didn't really think in those broad terms, and I didn't think how powerful data could be to inform questions that are really relevant for today. And so I try to say, we're studying these questions, and they're academic in a lot of ways, but they also help us understand a little bit about what might be happening in the future.
So they connect to the practical real world, so to speak.
And I mean, it's not necessarily that I'm going through the mechanics of the research in the classroom. I don't teach in a graduate level course, that's maybe where that would be appropriate, where I might teach you about global fire modeling or something very specific. But in undergraduate level courses, I kind of bring the big picture to the table and try to understand what that means.
Right. So helping them see how it all, again, ties together.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, the information you can gain from seeing scientists sort of working, I think, is one of the big advantages of teaching and doing research, is that, and it's not to say that people that are only teaching are not doing research, it's that they're often, their time is often set on teaching more than research. But both combination of the two is a really nice and place to be.
So we have just a couple more minutes. Let's talk about whether there's anything you think we haven't talked about that would be important for people to know about this, and perhaps a way to think about this is why should anybody watching this broadcast care? I mean, why does it relate to them as an individual or as people in this world?
Yeah, and I think that's a really fair question that any scientist should be able to address about their research. And one way to think about this is, I think, for me, seeing how dramatic an impact humans can have on any system on Earth, let alone fire. But I think that's takeaway message number one is humans can change the entire ecology of the planet using fire. It doesn't take very many humans, is what we're finding.
So as an illustration of
As
how
an
we have
illustration of
impact
how
in our
powerful.
individual acts.
Yeah, our individual acts can actually have huge impacts, and so you can understand that however you wish, but you could think of a farmer managing a field. If he has to manage a lot of crops, he's going to use fire. He's not going to use mechanized industry to do that necessarily, and fire is a very, very powerful tool. So humans, by proxy, are a very powerful tool in the planet. Right. And the second aspect would be, what all this means in terms of, okay, humans can impact the planet through fire systems, and the fire system can impact climate, and other systems can impact climate as well. And if humans can change climate, then what does that mean for something like fire systems that are underlying human systems, right? The idea, again, back to the idea of human kind of, the human environment sort of intersecting with the physical environment that we live in. And so looking for something that's bigger than building your house in a place where there's a nice view might be something that we can kind of bring to the table, and how fire managers sort of think about this, their work in the context of overall fire activity from the past, say, 1,000 years that we're studying, and what this means for the present day. Because right now, we're in a low point for fire activity, and we're beginning to spike as expected from the warming temperatures. And that's starting to become evident in the data, the paleo data that we're looking at, the past data that we're looking at, but it's very evident in satellite measurements. And so we know that the regimes are being tested right now, and our research, we think, can help inform how we think about the context for what that impact will be.
Well, we appreciate you helping us think about this very important issue. And I know that people can visit your website. You have a wonderful website here at UNC Charlotte where you keep up-to-date information on your research and what you're doing with your research. So we encourage people to look that up and access that. And I know also you sometimes do public talks, so who knows? Maybe that'll be an opportunity. So
absolutely.
We want to thank everybody watching today for joining us here with Brian, Maggie, and thanks from the Live Wire here at UNC Charlotte.